Hello and welcome to this Oak Tree English video on grammar expectations for ESOL Entry 3. This is the second in a series. The last one was about Entry 1 and 2. The next one will be about Level 1. ESOL teachers have to look at boring documents like this. This one from City and Guilds tells us what grammar you should know at entry levels of ESOL. In the first video I used this chart. This time I'm using the same graphic as it's in the public domain, but it is in grey writing. It's split into 6 areas. Each one should be developed more through each level. The areas are sentences, noun phrases, verb forms and time markers, adjectives, adverbs and discourse. We're going to look at each of these to explain what is expected. I will not cover all the expectations of entry 1 and 2 because I've made a video about them, which you should watch as a foundation for this video. The first grammar element on the list is making a good sentence. This is also the largest grammar area. At entry 3, you're expected to be able to produce all 3 types of sentences. That's simple with 1 independent clause, compound with 2 independent clauses joined by a conjunction like and or but, and also this time complex sentences with an independent clause and a dependent clause. I have a whole video on this called Sentences in Paragraphs, but a quick example is Edward the Confessor died in 1066. Simple. He didn't have any sons, so there was a question about who should become king after him. Compound, 2 sentences joined with so. If Edward had been clear about who should be the next king, the Battle of Hastings wouldn't have happened. This is a conditional sentence which by definition is a complex sentence. Next, we turn to there is, there are. At entry 3, you should be able to use a wide range of auxiliary verbs after there to express different tenses. For example, there have been 8 British kings named Edward. There will be a King William V next. There was going to be a King Arthur, but he died. That was Henry VIII's older brother, by the way. You should have a good grasp of the concept of clauses. Clauses are things that are groups of words. They're not just things that bearses have. They are groups of words called phrases that include a verb. They can make up a whole simple sentence, or they can be half of a compound sentence. But to make a complex sentence, you need at least 2 clauses, and one can't make sense on its own. The example of a complex sentence I used earlier, if Edward had been clear, the Battle of Hastings wouldn't have happened. The if clause couldn't exist on its own. It's dependent and needs the second independent clause to make a functioning sentence. This is also called a subordinate clause. You should also be able to use defining relative clauses, such as Elizabeth II, God bless her, was the queen who ruled the longest in British history. Much to Queen Victoria's dismay, I imagine. Defining relative clauses define the subject relative to the topic. They begin with words like who, which, that, but never what. English people make that mistake all the time. Don't you make the same mistake. So Her Majesty Elizabeth II was the queen who ruled, you see? Okay, good. Some verbs are followed by the ing form of a verb. Some are followed by the infinitive with to, and some are formed with the infinitive without to. And just to confuse everyone, some can take either form. You have to know which is which. For example, Edward VIII gave up being king. He avoided ruling honourably. He felt like behaving like a lovesick teenager. I have an opinion. Have you noticed? Examples of verbs followed by the infinitive could be King Philip of Spain planned to become king after Mary I died. Mary I was his wife. He threatened to invade England with the Spanish Armada. The Spanish Armada failed to attack England because of wind. The bare infinitive, that is the one without to, is used after modal verbs. For example, King Charles III had better defend the environment. That's where he's going to be a good king. Prince Harry would rather live in America. Some verbs can be followed by either with no change in meaning, such as Harry started to write or started writing his book after he got married. But sometimes there is a change in meaning. For example, Queen Victoria never stopped loving Albert, but she often stopped to remember him. The first one, she never stopped loving. She never stopped loving, ongoing, but she often stopped to remember. She stopped what she was doing in order to remember. This is also very, very commonly explained with smoke. So I stopped smoking. I gave up doing something that was killing me. I stopped to smoke. I stopped what I was doing. I stopped going to the gym in order to have a fag. If, by the way, any of you smoke, please stop immediately. It's very bad for you and will kill you eventually. Painfully and horribly. In the second stop, she stopped what she was doing to perform another action, while in the first, it's followed by a continuous action. Next, in this very long list of grammar terms, so we'd be pleased to move on to the next slide, we come to reported statements. This is where someone says something and you report it back, not necessarily using the same words. For example, King John of Robin Hood and Magna Carta fame said famous last words, "To God and St. Wulfstan I commend my body and soul." We could report this as King John said that he commended his body, he commended his body and soul to God and St. Wulfstan of Worcester. The main difference is that you should put a verb a tense back. So here's another example. When John's brother, Richard the Lionheart, said, "Youth, I forgive thee," to the young archer who killed him, it would have been reported that the king forgave the youth before he died. King Richard's followers still killed the youth, but you know, King Richard forgave him. It's nice. You should also be able to make questions, especially using the wh question words. Who, what, where, why, when, which, and how. I know how isn't technically a wh word because it's spelled with an H and not a WH, but it acts in the same way. Don't forget to invert the auxiliary. Who did Prince William marry? Not who Prince William did marry. Remember to invert that auxiliary. Okay, I'll stop teaching my grandmother to suck eggs. That's an idiom. I'll do a video about those another day. And move on to noun phrases. As well as sentences, you're expected to know about noun phrases. Nouns are words that give a name to something, such as table, chair, love, chickens. As well as everything mentioned at entry 1 and entry 2, watch the other video. You should also know about pre and post modifiers. So if we talk about Windsor, We might call it the royal town, where royal is the pre-modifier to describe the special relationship the town has with the royal family. But we would still refer to the town centre, where centre is the post-modifier to describe what part of town. You should also be familiar with determiners, which provide context to a noun. Words like this, these and those indicate which nouns we're referring to. This king is older than that king. My, your, her and his can relate to who the nouns are owned by or related to. For example, Charles is my king. William is his son. An important type of determiners are articles. You should know by now that English has only 2 articles, which you can extend to 3 or 4 if you want to be picky. These are definite articles, for defined or unique things, and the indefinite article, a or an, before a vowel, before a vowel. For singular things among many. There are also 0 articles for plurals and generic things like uncountable nouns, but this is just a fancy way of saying we don't use a word. For example, kings, 0 article, rule some countries. Some is a determiner. The UK has a king. God bless him. Indefinite, a king, because there are many kings in the world, and Charles is one among many. The king, which we know which king we're talking about, that of the UK, therefore we use the definite article, King Charles III. The king is Charles III. God bless him. Okay. Verb forms and time markers. You'll also be tested on tenses, that is time. Now I have a whole video on all 16 English tenses, and I have another putting them in the passive voice, which will help to put all this in perspective. At entry 3, you will be tested on all of the entry 1 and entry 2 tenses, plus present perfect and past continuous. The present perfect is used to talk about events in the past which have an effect on the present, such as the UK has been a monarchy for 400 years, or since James I, which is when it became a United Kingdom because he was a Scottish king ruling England. United Kingdom. Have we ever been a republic? We haven't had a president yet. Notice the common adverbs which are associated with the present perfect: for, since, ever, and yet. Now, used to is a formulation to talk about finished habits in the past. For example, King George III, who was insane and is very dead, used to talk to trees. He can't anymore because he's dead. You find very few dead people talking to trees. The past continuous is formed with was or were, that is the past tense of to be, plus the ing form, the present participle, and is used to give background information, often intersected with a past simple action, such as Henry VIII was playing tennis when Anne Boleyn was executed. Was being executed, you could say. When the executioner chopped Anne Boleyn's head off. All possibilities. Henry VIII was playing tennis. Was playing tennis. Modal verbs are a form of auxiliary or helping verbs, which don't change with the different subjects. For example, I must, he, you must, he, it, she, it. Must, not musts, must. They're useful for certain functions, such as expressing obligation. On a personal note, when I left my notes for the last video on our shared desk, my wife wrote on it the formulation you see on your screen: woulda, shoulda, coulda, knowing how this upsets my delicate grammatical sense. Would, should and could are followed by the auxiliary have. In the weak form, this is pronounced of. Tragically for English grammar, and also English speakers, the weak form of is also of, which leads even English people to say and even write would of, which gets shortened further to woulda. Ugh, I just feel dirty all over just saying these words. This is an annoying error which no Oak Tree English subscriber should ever make. So please, when you use these modals, say and write would have, should have and could have. For example, if Edward VIII had been honourable, Elizabeth II wouldn't have become Queen. He should have fulfilled his duty to the country, and Princess Elizabeth could have had a quieter life. Just for the record, I think Elizabeth II was an amazing person and an inspirational queen, and her uncle's weakness is most clearly seen next to her strength. But I digress. This brings me to the last area of marking for verb forms. These are phrasal verbs. You are expected to know and use a range of phrasal verbs or multi-word verbs where you have a verb and a particle, often a preposition. You will also be asked to show understanding of both separable and inseparable varieties. Some phrasal verbs, such as grow up or get on, have to stay together to retain their meaning. However, others, such as write down, can function set together or separated by an object. For example, Charles II wrote down the names of his father's enemies. Or Charles II wrote his father's enemies' names down. Wrote down his father's enemies, or wrote his father's enemies down. By the way, he put them in little black books, which is where we get the expression to be in someone's black book. Henry VIII's jester calmed him down and cheered him up. In this case, you can't move the object and say calmed down him or cheered him up him. That wouldn't work at all. But you can say that Henry cheered up when his jester performed. I feel I'm making this more confusing. Let's move on to the next thing. Having covered nouns and verbs, let's turn to adjectives. These are describing words such as beautiful, simple, angry, green. At entry 3, you should be able to recognise and use comparative and superlative forms. England has had 8 King Henrys, but some are more famous than others. Therefore, we are going to make use of some of them to help us describe these forms. Comparative is for comparing, obviously, and is normally formed by adding er to an adjective with one syllable, that is, sound, such as nice, nicer, cold, colder. But by adding the word more before a multi-syllable adjective and than afterwards, such as Henry VI is more famous than Henry IV. There's Henry VI, there's Henry IV. Henry VI, of course, is more famous, largely for losing the War of the Roses. Henry IV didn't do very much. Superlatives are the extremes of any scale, either the best or the worst, and they're formed by preceding an adjective with the, because there can be only one. Ask Connor MacLeod of the Clan MacLeod. And ending with est or est, or preceding a longer adjective with the most, such as, but Henry VIII is the most famous. You should also be able to use other comparative structures, such as Henry V is as famous as Henry VII. Henry V, of course, Battle of Agincourt, wars, the 100-Year War. Henry VII, the first Tudor, but people don't remember very much more about him than that. Henry VIII, of course, is the most famous Henry, King Henry that we've ever had. Those are adjectives. Having covered nouns, verbs and adjectives, you will also be tested on adverbs and prepositions. These are often the little words which get missed out, but are very important for making yourself understood. At entry 3, you'll need a wider range of prepositions than at entry 1 and 2. So as well as behind and above, you can use along. You can use words like within, throughout, and beyond. A fun way to learn these is to write a preposition poem or a sentence. For example, among all the monarchs in the UK, Queen Elizabeth II, betwixt Charles III and George VI, was most beloved throughout time. In addition to prepositions, you should use prepositional phrases. These are groups of words without a verb that begin with a preposition and have an object. They are used to modify or to describe. An example I've already used here is in addition. But there are many that collocate, such as George III was around the bend, meaning mad. Buckingham Palace is down the road from Trafalgar Square. That is true. The road in question is this one in the picture, the Mall. We never know what is happening behind the scenes. These are prepositional phrases. They're also idioms. You will be expected to employ a wider range of adverbial phrases. There they are. In a range of functions, and that means groups of words which modify a clause. Functions might include possibility and certainty. Perhaps Harry will return home. It is definitely possible. It is definitely possible that, there they are, it's definitely possible that King Charles will forgive his son. On the other hand, he might not. He might not. After all, Harry's book was a terrible idea. It really was. On the whole, there's another one, look at this. I think the country would accept him back, but in the meantime, his wife should change her behaviour. She's making a lot of trouble. You should also be aware of the uses and limitations of intensifiers such as to, enough, and so. Students often make mistakes here, so it's worth being clear. To is always negative. If you are too tired, you shouldn't drive. If you are too hungry, you should eat before you faint. It's always an excess with negative results. I am too lazy to get a job. George IV was too fat to wear tight trousers. Thus the fashion changed for baggier trousers. Enough is about sufficiency. George IV was cruel enough to ban his wife from his coronation. She died as a result. So always has a result and shouldn't be used without one. George was so cruel that he didn't tell his wife of their daughter's death. You can't just say, George was so cruel. It's a comparison, so you need to have another clause in there. George was so cruel that he didn't tell his wife of their daughter's death. George IV was a bad king, a bad man. Finally, in this very long list of grammar, you should know we come to discourse. This will be tested in the oral exam because it's mostly about speaking, except the first element. Discourse markers are those little phrases that let you know where you are in a text or argument. At entry 3, you should be able to use these to show addition, in addition, furthermore, moreover, to show sequence, firstly, secondly, next, after that, finally, and to introduce contrast. On the one hand, on the other hand, by contrast, there are a range of things you might use to make your spoken English sound more natural and relaxed. These are little markers to mark where you are in your talk. These could be any way to change a subject. On top of that, to give extra information. To be honest, to introduce an unlikely or surprising opinion. As I was saying, to come back to your main point after a distraction. An ellipsis is that pause that is marked in written work with 3 dots. This can be for a few purposes. It can be used to miss out unnecessary words. William Shakespeare is the most famous writer. The most famous ... writer. The most famous Tudor, theatrical, Warwickshire writer. Or to pause for effect. Henry VIII had 6 wives. Or an unfinished thought. Edward VIII didn't think with his head brain, but with his... Or a trail off into silence. I never realised British history was so full of drama. Finally, you should be able to use vague language. This is where you talk about something without being too specific. You should avoid this in academic work, but it is useful in spoken English. So instead of saying Richard III was a good king, you could say Richard III may have been misunderstood. Instead of he didn't kill the princes in the tower, you might say some things history says may not have happened as written. I hope this video has been helpful. If you found that there are areas of grammar which you don't understand or need to practice, then that is exactly what you should do. Ask your teacher for exercises on the areas you find most difficult, and then practice them until they are second nature. Within a few weeks of doing this daily, your English will have improved massively. I hope you've enjoyed this video. If so, please remember to like, share and subscribe to Oak Tree English. Goodbye.